Tonight, we've got a real treat and a special opportunity to have Andreas Schleicher with us. And Andreas, I know, needs no introduction as the Director for Education and Skills at OECD. But I do want to just say briefly, having had the chance, like many of us, to learn from Andreas and his work over the past several years, that there really are few people in the world who had as much impact on education, on educators and students as Andreas has had. I've just been so compelled year after year how in the US and across the world, the analysis, the data, the non-ideological, straightforward, education, child-driven, youth-driven focus on how to equip educators and decision makers and policy makers with information on data to guide their work has been critical. It's driven policy at the national level in many countries. It's equipped educators. This global learning network that we've had, including the PISA for Schools, has been only possible with Andreas's vision and OECD's partnership. And both Andreas and the whole team from OECD have been extraordinary partners in putting together this conference as well. I also want to thank for this conference and this dinner and beyond, but for the whole conference, both the 1-8 Foundation and the Kern Foundation are here. They've sponsored this. We would not be here without these two foundations, so I want to actually give a round of applause to these two foundations as well. And before I turn this to Andreas can give some remarks, then I'll come back and we might have some questions and answers. I would just ask you to think about a few of the questions you've been reflecting on all day. And kind of get yourself in the space of those as you listen to Andreas. So earlier in the day, we talked about how you define your purpose at your schools. And as you think for students and families, what really is the purpose for your school? Second, what's the nature of work and the changes in work that you're learning about that are changing what skills are expected and needed for students? And third, what are you learning about what knowledge and skills you're teaching in your schools you want to hold on to? And what are things that you might need to consider changing? Consider those questions, and as Andreas speaks, you'll be learning a ton, as always, about what he'll share, but I would consider what are the implications for you in your school and your educational system, whether you're in the United States or whether you're from any of the countries that are here. And then after Andreas has a chance to speak, all of you will have a chance to have a good Q&A session as well. So with that, I really have to, it's my pleasure to introduce really one of the most knowledgeable, data-driven, informed, and integrity-driven leaders I've ever met, Andreas Schleicher.
Thank you, John, and also I want to really thank America Chiefs for the fantastic pioneering role that you have played in the United States, and actually to also advance the global education agenda. Now, when you think about the OECD test for schools, PISA for schools, it's actually been born in a conversation between us, John, and I think if you look how far it has got, the traction it has got in many parts of the world, I think this is really very much a tribute to you, and it's a pleasure to be here with schools that aspire to be world-leading schools. And it's actually, when you start to get where the highest performing education systems are, it's easy. It's emulating what others are doing. When you actually need to move the frontier, you have an entirely different set of challenges. And that frontier itself is moving. I know that you have been discussing the impact of digitalization. Now you have robots taking over whole factories. You have augmented reality, bringing the world's most advanced knowledge right into what you do immediately. And that precisely means that the world no longer rewards people just for what they know. When Google knows everything, it rewards people for what they can do with what they know. It actually doesn't diminish the importance of knowledge, but it shifts the importance of knowledge from knowing something, content knowledge, to having a deeper understanding of the discipline, epistemic understanding, your capacity to think like a scientist as opposed to know lots of things of biology, chemistry, and physics. Your capacity to think like a mathematician as opposed to just knowing formulas and equations. Your capacity to think like a philosopher. Those things are becoming increasingly important in these times. Digitalization has been incredibly democratizing. Now, anybody can participate in social processes today, but it's also incredibly concentrated powers. If you think about, Google makes $1 million per employee. That's 10 times the average in the United States. that level of concentration was sort of difficult to imagine in the times in the past it has happened. No? This is about scale without mass. Digitalization has been incredibly particularizing. The smallest voice can be heard anywhere. Now, you post something on Twitter and the world tomorrow can talk about it. But it's also incredibly homogenizing, no? Squashing individuality, cultural uniqueness. Digitalization has been incredibly empowering. You can do amazing things. Everything now starts with a big idea. To produce something great, you don't need a big factory, you don't need a lot of money. All you need is a compelling idea. Anyone. But it's also been incredibly disempowering. If you think about it, you become the slaves of technology, often, even in our daily lives. And where you end up on this chart has a lot to do with the knowledge, skills, and character qualities that people bring with them. In effect, digitalization has two effects. When you look at this in terms of routine and non-routine tasks, it has shifted the frontier. Routine tasks, the kind of things that are easy to teach, easy to test, are precisely those kind of things that are easy to digitize. And on the other hand, you can see the tasks with technology intensity is increasing. And you can put those things together, and you can really see what is rising as the kind of tasks that people do that are hard to code in the form of an algorithm and that are highly technology intensive. That's what we actually see in labor markets. And basically, technology, that means technology substitutes those workers who work with routine kind of skills and knowledge. And that's the kind of agenda that you hear in the public debate. It's all about robots stealing our jobs. But technology also complements human skills. And that's actually the empowerment factor. This is the world of new opportunities. And I think the question we need to ask ourselves today is, how can we pair the artificial intelligence of computers with the kind of human qualities that are going to make the big difference? In a way, it's the same kind of questions people posed themselves before the Industrial Revolution, that killed another class of jobs. But at the end of the day, people were a lot better off, those people with the right skills, and I think that's the kind of question. We also need to take to heart that skills are multidimensional. It's no longer about, specialization, one set of skills. It's about, the kind of knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values that matter for success. Here's something important on the empowerment factor. We've actually looked at skills in the adult workforce. This is not our PISA test, but it's a kind of variant of PISA for adults that we use. And one thing that you can see is if you do not work, and if you work in one of the less digital workplaces today, you can actually see the further you are from your degree, on the zero, basically that's where you graduate, where you leave education, and then to the right is the number of years since then. And you can actually see your kind of problem-solving skills, problem-solving in a digital environment, really deteriorates. Every year that you're further away from your degree, you actually lose in value in terms of the kind of digital problem-solving skills that matter for success today. If you don't work in a kind of technology-intensive workplace, if you do work in a technology-intensive workplace, it looks actually very different. You can actually see you keep your skills and actually you advance and you grow them. So the environment in which you work doesn't take things, technology doesn't take things away from you, but actually it adds to your skill set. There's something actually more to this. It's really interesting. When you work in a more technology-intensive work, you tend to read more, you tend to write more, you tend to do more numeracy. And those kinds of skills are actually always developed through using them. You don't use them, you lose them. And actually, a technology-intensive workplace tends to enhance those kinds of human capacities. And the same is true with a kind of non-routine intensity. That's what it means. We should not be afraid of those kinds of technological developments. They are actually, for those who embrace them, deeply empowering. And it gets even more interesting. You can see in a technology-intensive workplace, you are more likely to learn from your coworkers and learn with your coworkers. You are more likely to learn by doing, actually trying out things, advancing. And you are more likely to keep up to date. And again, you can see the same effect in a kind of job set, task set is involving non-routine tasks. So once again, those are the kind of environments that keep people growing, advancing their skills. And that's something I'd like to look with you tonight at. First of all, starting with those kinds of digital problem-solving skills, you know, the capacity of people. And this is actually has a lot less to do than you think with technology. It's really about conceptual skills. In the last century, in the 20th century, literacy was about decoding information. You know, somebody else had written something for you, and you had to process it, understand it, and so on. Linear text, we read books, text. Today, and actually, when you didn't know the answer to a question, you could look it up in an encyclopedia, and you could trust the answer to be true. And that's what we used to tell our students. In the time of Google, you know, when you look up a question, you find 30,000 answers, and nobody is telling you what is right and what is wrong and what is true, what is not true. Literacy has become a construct of constructing information, not about extracting information. Now the construct has changed. And that's really what navigating the digital world is about. It's about this kind of compass and navigation skills that you need to find your own way in an increasingly complex, ambiguous world. And that's when I talk about digital skills. That's really what I mean. Can we navigate this world? It's true also with the kind of social skill dimension. One of the things that the digital world is doing to all of us is that it puts us into echo chambers. Now we have wonderful algorithms that sort people into groups that are similar. You always talk to people who think like you and who believe in similar things like you. And that's basically what, you know, this kind of social networks tend to do. And digital skills is about building the kind of bridging social capital. Now, can you actually, you know, embrace other ways of thinking? Can you see the world through different lenses and perspectives? No? Being successful in the digital world means actually to have those skills. Now, once again, in our survey of adult skills, we looked at those kinds of things. Here are some results. When you study this for older people in the age group 55 to 65-year-olds, it looks pretty bleak. You have only about, 1 in 10 workers in the older age group equipped with those kinds of skills. In the United States, it looks a little bit better, 1 in 5, but that's still not sort of a lot. There's sort of a lot of skill gaps in the older generation, those kinds of information-intensive kind of jobs. And now you'll tell me, well, we fixed all of that. We have the digital natives, the young people, they know all of those kinds of things. And in fact, among 16 to 24-year-olds, it does look better. The bars get longer. But actually, they're not particularly long. You still talk only about 1 in 2 young workers equipped for the flat world. And I know this is something that you sort of start to question, and you think about all of the people that you know all of the digital tools, who can navigate all of this information. And that's true, but we tend to have a very biased view of the world. When you go out on the street, every second person whom you meet is not having those skills. That's what those test results really tell us. There's a lot of people whom we don't know and who actually represent a different world. And they're actually the kind of losers of those kinds of processes that we see today. You can also see that progress has been very uneven across countries. Now, the United States used to be ahead after, New Zealand. Today, the United States is more at the lower end of the distribution, not because things got worse. No? Things actually got better. The bar for the younger group is longer than the bar for the older group. But things got better so much faster in so many other countries. Now, you can look at Singapore. At the very bottom of the distribution among older workers, at the top, for people just moving into the labor force. That's also showing what is possible. Actually, we can significantly increase the share of people equipped with those kinds of digital literacy skills. But even in Singapore, you have still 1/3 of young people who do not have access to the flat world, do not have the kind of minimum skills. And I'm not, when we designed that test, I asked myself many times, how could anybody get those kinds of tasks wrong? You talk about really some basic information processing skills, but the reality is a lot of people are struggling with this. Let's talk about another dimension, non-routine analytic skills. This is something that is very important. When you look at the evolution of skills, we have seen a decline in manual skills. That's very well known. But the steepest decline is really now on the routine cognitive skills, the kind of things that are easy to teach, easy to test. Those things are disappearing. Where things are increasing, on the one end, is non-routine analytic skills. That's your capacity not to reproduce what you know, but to extrapolate from what you know and to use and apply your knowledge in a novel situation. The kind of things that we're trying to assess with PISA. But that's only half of the story. The other line that is rising is the green one. Actually, it's rising even faster. And those are social skills. The capacity of people to collaborate, to compete, to connect, to work with other people. And that's something I think school systems haven't yet grasped fully. Yeah, I know we all talk about social skills in schools, but at the end of the school year, we test students individually. And we say how important it is to collaborate, but we ask students to sit behind individual desks. So there's still a gap between the reality and the kind of aspiration. But the real world really demands those kind of skills more and more. Let's have a look at this. Now, when you actually talk to teachers, and we did that, we surveyed teachers in the United States and many other countries, most teachers have a pretty advanced kind of mindset. 95% of teachers say, my role as a teacher is to facilitate students' own inquiry. This is not about, broadcasting knowledge, but facilitating students' own inquiry. 9 out of 10 teachers believe that. In the United States and many other countries too. You have 8 out of 10 who say students learn best by finding solutions on their own. And still, 8 out of 10 who say thinking and reasoning is more important than content knowledge. And now we say, well, teachers have arrived in the digital world. That's what we're talking about. That is what this new world is about. But it's only half of the story. Now, when you actually ask yourself what happens inside classrooms, and that's what we know through PISA, the world looks very different. If teachers would do what they say in the United States, you would find the United States at the bottom of the list of countries that emphasize memorization, the kind of 20th century knowledge acquisition, rehearsal, routine exercises, practice, repetition. But I can tell you that the bottom place is already taken by Switzerland. And then comes Poland. And then comes Germany. In fact, the United States comes pretty high up on this list. If I would expand this with all of the OECD countries, you'd find the United States in the top 10 countries focusing on memorization, the reproduction of subject matter content, the kind of things that make you more vulnerable in the digital world. If I had you ask you at the beginning here, who's coming out on top in rote learning, many might have tipped China. No? But actually, that's about 20 years ago. In the last 10, 15 years, most East Asian countries have got the curve. They still do some memorization, because memorization is an important skill. But you'll also find them actually very strong on the kind of elaboration strategies, deep learning, intrinsic motivation, critical thinking, creativity, non-routine problems. This is important. This is what happens in the classroom. And we have a real gap between what teachers aspire to and say they're doing and what actually happens in the classroom. And this is what actually shapes learning outcomes. This is the experiences that students have. According to and students at age 15, that's where we tested them, are actually quite good observants of what happens in terms of the implemented curriculum. In a way, we have the intended curriculum, that's what we want to do. We have the implemented curriculum, that's what's actually happening, that's what you see here. And then you have the achieved curriculum, that's what you can see in terms of learning results. And there is a big gap between those two. And that's really what we need to deal with if we want to advance in the 21st century. We don't need to change aspirations, they are there, you can see that, but the delivery is still advancing. Why is this important? In the green area, I'm going to show you those types of tasks from our PISA test where memorization actually helps you, makes you more successful. And in the red part, I'm showing you those areas, those tasks where memorization hinders success. And I give you a cue. The red part is larger than the green part. But actually, when you order the tasks by difficulty from left to right, it looks like this. For straightforward, simple tasks, memorization is very effective. But as soon as problems get more complex, memorization actually rather hinders than helps you. When you look at control strategies, that's basically about managing your learning, setting goals, persevering, sort of following up on things. And these are things that you can teach really well. Control strategies is something that you can develop really well. You can see actually they are helping you across the spectrum, but even also they are more for the easier tasks. Then when problems get really complex, it's not enough either. You can see basically there things get so-so. What you need there is exactly those kinds of elaboration strategies I highlighted before. The capacity of students to connect what they know with the unfamiliar ones, to think out of the box, to connect the dots where the next idea is going to come from. And that's actually where, in the case of the United States, teachers are relatively speaking weakest when we ask the students about experienced learning practices. But those are the kind of tasks in the kind of 21st century that are becoming more important, that are harder to digitize, that are harder to automate, that are harder to outsource. This is about tomorrow's educational practice. The question, of course, is, how you can shift the balance. And I'm going to come to this in a moment. I want to emphasize one thing more, and that's the social skill dimension. In fact, just this year, we released first results from our first PISA assessment of social skills. We assessed the capacity of students not only to solve problems individually, but actually to solve problems collaboratively. It was actually very interesting that the results don't go together automatically. Being a great individual problem solver doesn't guarantee you can also solve problems with others. And the same is true for countries. There are countries that do really well on individual problem solving and do poorly on collaborative problem solving, and vice versa. Social skills. Let's have a look at some of the results. What did we look to? We basically wanted to see whether students can, first of all, establish a common understanding of a problem. That's what you need to do today. Whether they can figure out together what's the right action to take. And then also whether they can, keep a team together when things get difficult and controversial. Those are the kind of things that we were testing in this assessment, and these are the results. You can see, Singapore came out on top of this. And that's really interesting. Singapore was also good on individual problem solving. But they came out even better on social problem solving. Japan, same thing. Japan does really well on PISA, but it did also particularly well on the social skill dimension. Now, there are other surprises. You look at China, for example. Remember the Chinese did so well on individual problem solving? They're not great collaborative problem solvers. Look at the United States. Yeah. In the PISA mathematics assessment, you remember the United States was deep in the red area. No? Number 30 out of 35 OECD countries in mathematics. Social skills, the United States is well in the green area. It's a great strength of students in the United States. So individual skills don't guarantee your social skills, and social skills are becoming increasingly important. Again, countries that do, relatively speaking, better on social skills than individual skills include, Japan, Korea, Singapore, Australia, and United States. And then there are countries that struggle with this. Turkey, Russian Federation, China. Some of these countries, students are doing well individually, but they struggle when they solve problems collectively. Here you have actually another way of looking at this, and this is the share of students who do really well. And this is something where we were most surprised. This level, basically, at level 4, you basically have to solve problems with a fairly high collaborative complexity. You have to be aware of some group dynamics, But you'd look at the task and you think, well, every 15-year-old should be doing this. No. These were not cognitively difficult tasks. But you have, even in top performer Singapore, only 20% of students who reached that highest level. In relative terms, that's what you saw before, countries vary. But in absolute terms, actually collaborative skills are not really well established in any of our education systems, not even in Singapore. Most countries really struggle with this. This is something that we don't ask students to do. Collaborative learning environments are still rare, and the outcomes are basically still quite basic. We also found huge gender differences. When we tested individual problem-solving skills in 2012, boys were ahead in virtually every country. When we tested collaborative problem-solving skills, girls were ahead in every country. And the differences are really big, and even, you can tell me, well, that's also because girls are doing better in reading, but in this chart, I've taken all of that into account. Basically, I have controlled for performance in science, reading, mathematics, everything I know about those students. And you can still see that girls in many countries are like 20, 30 points on the PISA scale ahead. And remember, 30 points is about a school year. So the reverse picture that we see for individual problem-solving skills. And you can actually see that is often mirrored in the attitudes. When you basically ask boys and girls for their attitudes, girls are more likely to say, I'm a good listener, I enjoy seeing my classmates to be successful, I take into account what others are interested in, I enjoy considering different perspectives. That's clearly something which girls say more likely. And boys are more likely to prefer working as part of a team, sort of where the kind of social aspect come into play. But unfortunately, the right side doesn't predict performance. The left side does. So that is basically something that where we can see very clear gender patterns, and they are visible in most of the countries for which we have comparative data. Can you do something about it? Well, actually, some interesting data. Physical exercise, for example, is something that relates quite clearly to attitudes towards collaboration. Where students do more sports, typically they have a more positive attitude towards building those kinds of relationships. So physical exercise is one of the environments where you can actually influence those attitudes and expectations. But it's not just about, sports. You can also see where students are more often given opportunities to explain their own ideas in a lesson, spend time in the laboratory carrying out practical experiments, and also we invite them to argue about science questions. So basically interaction in science class among students with a teacher. Those things are actually really good predictors for positive attitudes towards collaboration. Where there was more interaction in the class, you had a greater proportion of students say, I'm a good listener, I enjoy seeing my classmates be successful, I take into account what others are interested in, and so on. So it's another example for how the organization of learning and the learning environments can really shape attitudes towards collaboration, and as you could see at the beginning, attitudes shape outcomes. So that's really very, very important. Technology. That's an interesting question because collaboration has a lot to do these days with technology, with whom you communicate, collaborate, and so on. But actually, we could only observe small effects. And actually, when you look at playing video games, the effects were largely negative, particularly when we don't account for social background. Surprising on surface. You think about video games, they're mostly interactive. You work with actually others, so they should enhance collaborative capacity. But it seems they're more likely to isolate people. They're more likely to work against it. It's not visible for internet, chatting, social networks. Those things were indeed positively correlated with collaborative problem-solving skills. I must say, we are just starting to analyze and understand those patterns, but it's clearly worth looking more deeply into this. What role can and does technology have to enhance collaborative skills or, be a barrier to them? Parents. You can see in virtually every country where students talk to their parents after school, it's a positive relationship to performance and collaboration. In fact, you know, the simple question whether parents ask their children, how was school, had a higher predictive power on outcomes than parental income. No. It's not about whether you have a degree, it's not about spending 3 hours homework with your child, it's simply telling your child what you do in school matters to me. That simple statement is more important than family income on the kind of social skills that students demonstrate on a test, after controlling anything. Where next? Actually, the next round of PISA is focusing on global competency. This is really about whether students can examine local, global, and intercultural issues, see themselves in the bigger picture, whether they understand and appreciate the perspectives, whether they engage in appropriate interaction when they are encountering people differently and things like this. Now, it's going to be a huge challenge for this, and it embraces knowledge of people, knowledge of global issues, intercultural issues, socioeconomic development, interdependence, all of those kind of things that we see every day on television. Do students really understand those issues? We're also interested in their skills. It's not just about what you do, it's again what you can do with this, about can you reason, critically reason with information? Can you communicate in a context with divergent thinking? Can you take perspectives? Can you put yourself into somebody else's shoes? And so on. And we don't stop at skills. We also want to see about people's attitudes, to what extent they're open to people from other ways of thinking, other cultures, whether they have respect for cultural differences and so on. And the one thing that we are not yet able to put into numbers is the question around values, but we do know that they deeply matter. And the difference between attitudes is that attitudes are to something, or to people, to groups, and so on, whereas values transcend those things. And we're not able to put that into numbers yet. You ask yourself, how can they actually do this? In part, we do this with a test. We have developed that now on knowledge and cognitive skills. When it comes to social skills and attitudes, we basically do that through a kind of questionnaire. So that's really, in a nutshell, the kind of instruments that we are using for the next round of PISA. Let me conclude with some reflections on this. Now, building tomorrow's school system, first of all, involves a shift from sorting people, that's what we know how to do really well in education, to ensuring that every student can succeed. And there's some really powerful data from PISA that show that this is not a distant dream. The concept of mastery learning, setting clear goals for everyone, and having this deep belief that every student can learn and every student can succeed, and doing whatever it takes to help those students succeed, is something that we see in some countries now. Whenever I show kind of PISA results, people always say, well, these people are comparing apples with oranges, and there are some countries more diverse and some countries have more immigrants, and you can't really compare all of that. Well, you can actually get around that by comparing apples with apples and oranges with oranges. And the way to do this is to look at performance by decile of social background. So we have an international scale where we group students by their socioeconomic background, and then we could compare students who come out of similar contexts. Look at this. You take the internationally 10% most disadvantaged students in the Dominican Republic in the red square, and the people from their privileged backgrounds in the green triangle. And you can see a huge achievement gap. Some people look at this and say, yeah, poverty is destiny. There's nothing what you can do about it. But then you look at this across countries, and you can see how students from similar social backgrounds come out so differently, depending on where they go to school. You can see that the 10% most disadvantaged students in Vietnam do as well as the average student in the United States and the OECD, and they do better than the 10% wealthiest students in many of the countries of Latin America. poverty is not destiny. So I think this move from sorting people to actually developing the potential of all children is a quite realistic aspiration, something that we can achieve. It starts early on, no? Pre-primary education, early childhood education and care. And you can see how this varies across countries. Now, on the left side, you have countries where children go almost, to some form of early learning from birth, because by age 6 they have already 4 to 5 years of exposure. You have countries like the United States, it's between 2 and 3 years, and countries like Turkey where it's less than 2 years. Huge variability in early childhood education care. But the really troubling gap is the one between the green and the red dot. That's basically between wealthy children in green and red children, disadvantaged children. The idea of early childhood education is to narrow social gaps, to put people on a level playing field, and to give students from disadvantaged background a good start. The reality is it works exactly the opposite way. Students from wealthy families tend to have access to the better opportunities and more of this. Now you say, well, maybe we can't fix things early in the life of people. We can still fix things later in life. But have a look at this. People are a lot less likely to participate in any form of lifelong learning if they haven't acquired good foundational skills in school. Whatever you do later in your life tends to reinforce skill differences that come out early in the lives of people. Continuing education and training is a great thing, a great idea, but it doesn't moderate, it tends to reinforce differences that come out of schooling. There's actually no way, no shortcut to getting schooling right from the start. Second point is really, how do we move in a world where we can no longer tell teachers exactly what to teach and how to teach because the world is changing so fast, to a world in which we create true ownership of professional practice at the front line. That's another of the differentiators of the world-leading schools and world-leading education system. People at the front line own their professional practice. Have a look at, this is sort of a little illustration of this. This is about, on the vertical axis, you see the student-teacher ratio, the share of teachers that you devote to every 100 students. The lower you are on the chart, the more generous you are in putting more resources into the system. And on the horizontal axis, you see the class size. And now, at first, you might ask yourself, well, the class size and the student-staff ratio should be the same thing. But you see there's almost no relationship between the two across countries. Compare the United States and China. They have a similar student-staff ratio, same number of teachers for every 100 students. But the Chinese have very large classes, and the United States has rather small classes. And you say, well, the smaller classes are great, but there's a price for this. And the price is that American teachers have very little time to do anything else than teaching. Teaching load is very high by international standards. You go to China, if you're a teacher, you teach between 11 and 16 hours per week. But you actually don't work less than an American teacher. You even work more than an American teacher. So what's the difference? Well, every week you spend at least an hour looking at somebody else's classroom. You take part in professional learning communities. You work with parents, you work with individual students. You spend up to 8 hours per week actually helping struggling students to succeed. You have enormous amount of resources to help those students who need your help most. So, same resource, different use. Teaching hours, I just said so. You could see actually the relative teaching load in the United States is actually by far the highest in the advanced economies. You can have countries like Costa Rica, Colombia, Chile, and so on, where it's higher, but there are very few. Next point is, how do we move in the kind of 21st century in an education system that is moving information upwards, the kind of administrative accountability that we know so well, to a system where we actually look outwards to the next teacher, to the next school, to build kind of more lateral systems of, peer collaboration, accountability. It's another differentiator of high-performing education systems. And actually on the surface, it looks that this is already happening. You can see basically when it comes to exchanging and sharing information, there's a lot going on in schools. But when you actually look at the deeper forms of collaboration that actually matter for success, they're very rare. 1 out of 10 teachers basically engaging in classroom observations. Of course, there are countries where this is much more common, but in most countries, the deeper forms of teacher collaboration that are actually about professional ownership are still rare. Why is this a problem? Because the more often teachers teach jointly, the more they observe other teachers' classes, the more they engage in joint activities, the more they take part in collaborative professional learning, the greater their sense of being an effective teacher, the greater their job satisfaction. Many of those dimensions really go together. So another challenge in education to move from, the industrial work organization where information shifts upwards to a professional work organization where information shifts outward. This is really from advancing from delivering wisdom to making sure that professional knowledge is created at the front line by researchers, by people who are actually experts in their own professional practice. This is about, you having professional knowledge, degree of professional autonomy, and it's about the collaborative culture. And this is to do with, the quality of learning outcomes. Time is always considered an important ingredient for success. Everybody will tell you, I need more time for mathematics, I need more time for history in order to achieve better outcomes. And the reality is, it's true. Actually, within every country, learning time is one of the best predictors for student success. You add more time, you get better outcomes. But then you look at this across countries, and you can see the longer students spend in class, in school, the worse they come out in PISA, internationally. And now you ask yourself, how can you reconcile this? Within a country, more time gets you better outcomes. Across countries, more time makes things worse. And the answer, of course, is that outcomes are always the product of the quantity of learning and the quality of the instructional environment. You always can improve outcomes by adding more time, but if you want to really improve things fast, you need to change the way in which students teach and learn. And this is exactly what our data show. You can see here the amount of time that students spend in school, and in yellow, the amount of time students spend learning out of school, homework, tutoring, all sorts of things. And you can see how this varies hugely. You look at the United Arab Emirates here. Now, students, number one, 60 hours per week learning. And you look at the other end, Finland, a little bit more than 35 hours, half of what the students in UAE learn. But when it comes to the actual learning gains per hour of instruction, you can see in the case of Finland, Germany, Switzerland, Japan, Estonia, students spend little time but learn a lot, whereas in the United Arab Emirates, students spend a lot of time and learn relatively little. So that varies hugely across countries. And you can see basically most countries are somewhere in the middle. So improving the instructional environment is far more promising than just adding more time. And so it's less expensive. Whenever you have to make a choice between improving the quality of instruction and teaching and adding more time or making classes smaller, choose the former. The past was also divided. We divide students by subjects and destinations. The future really needs to be a lot more cross-curricular, integrated. Having more opportunities for students to think across the boundaries of subject matter disciplines, to learn collaboratively. And those things are really hard to manage because they work against the kind of school organization in many ways. The past was about compliance, conformity, making students all very similar. The future is really about making students more ingenious, and that also means reflecting this in teaching practice. The past was about, learning being a place. The future is about recognizing that learning is really something that cuts through anything that we do. And it has a lot to do with technology and other things. And I mentioned already, the move from administrative control and accountability to the kind of professional forms of work organization that are visible in the frontier education systems today. And it's also a move from managing, administering things to building the kind of instructional leadership that make school systems successful. And very last point, it's about building more coherence into education. It's about, aligning policies and practice from early childhood education to adult life. It's about, making sure that what we say we actually do is the implementation, closing the implementation gap. And it's about fidelity of implementation, doing what we actually say. Huge challenges. At the very same time, I think we see in virtually every country, world-leading schools that do get that right, and we see education systems, some education systems moving very rapidly to that frontier. Thank you very much.
So we're going to have questions. I'm going to ask the first question, and then we're going to open it up. I may come back for a second as well. Andreas, this year, you mentioned this. We know tomorrow you're going to be an announcement on these new global competencies, and you previewed us for us tonight, so it was nice to have a chance to preview of that. And this year, for the first time, you had this assessment and this study on the social skills, the collaborative problem-solving skills. Some people in your position might have just stuck with the competencies and skill assessments that you've had. You made the decision, OECD made the decision to say, you know what, you're keeping those, but you're moving in this direction. I'm sure that was not an easy step. Why'd you do that? What drove the decision-making of that? What changes, what facts drove you to institute these new assessments and these new competencies?
Yeah, some people say if you want to measure change, you can never change the measures. But if you never change the measures, you basically freeze education systems. And I do think we need to recognize that the world is changing. We need to recognize that the value of social competencies is rising for students. And if you come from a wealthy background, there are many ways how you acquire social skills, out of the school context. Your parents will teach you, others, and so on. If you come from a disadvantaged background, you end up in the workplace, you find very quickly out that you're not prepared. And I do think, we now need to provide the education that we used to provide for some, for all, and that means also we need to build the metrics to see whether our education systems deliver for the 21st century. And again, social skills are an important dimension. The results are not, what we like to see, but I think it's only by looking at those that we can have a chance to improvement. What we will not see, we will not improve. At least I believe that.
In the academic skills, you mentioned they were not a predictor necessarily of social skills. Is that right?
Yeah, there's a relationship between the two, but it only explains about 70% of the variance. So yes, of course, and to be a collaborative problem solver, you need to also have some individual problem-solving skills. But the relationship was far weaker than, for example, the relationship between mathematics and reading. So there is a real sort of difference in social skills.
One other question before I open up. Earlier today we talked about some discussion around the role of knowledge in our changing world and changing economy. And you spoke to that briefly earlier in comments. I wonder if you could speak to what you see as the constant or changing role of knowledge in helping an educated citizen be successful.
Yeah, I think knowledge is always the core of academic success and success in life. But I think the forms of knowledge that matter for success are changing very rapidly. Once again, content knowledge is becoming less and less, relevant as people can search those things on Google and everywhere. But actually, you can only search on Google if you have the epistemic understanding, if you know the foundations of a discipline, if you can think like a mathematician, you can think like a scientist, you can think like a philosopher. And I think it's that kind of epistemic knowledge that gains in value. It's about conceptual understanding rather than, the surface and the phenomena. And I think that transition is actually really hard to achieve because it's so much easier to teach the kind of surface knowledge. It's so much easier to train people how to solve a kind of equation or to remember a formula. And it's so much harder to get someone to understand what is actually the meaning of an exponential function. Not how do I calculate it, what processes and routines are behind, but what is the essence of it. Now, if we would really understand what an exponential function means, all of us, when the Ebola crisis broke out, we would have sent 3,000 doctors. They are not 200. And I think that kind of conceptual understanding is really missing. I give you a very practical example, some that really sort of made me aware of something. In 2009, remember, middle of the financial crisis, everybody was saying, financial literacy is the topic of the day. Everybody needs to be financial literate. So then we said, okay, we assessed that in PISA. We had a test of financial literacy. And our expectation was those countries that do a lot of financial education, including the United States, they will come out really well on the financial literacy test. This was surface knowledge, content knowledge. We found no relationship whatsoever between financial education and financial literacy. Who came out on top of this test? The students in Shanghai in China. They had never heard about financial education, nor financial literacy. But they could think like a mathematician. They understood the kind of concepts and ideas behind those phenomena that they observed. And because they understood those ideas, they could immediately extrapolate to the new world of financial education. But it's hard to teach. It's much harder to develop those kinds of conceptual understanding than to teach the surface. It's really about a deeper level of professionalism. But in my view, that's really what the digital economy is pushing us to. No? It's really about how we pair artificial intelligence that's doing all of that kind of routine stuff with the kind of deeper understanding of the disciplines.
Thank you.
And I actually think, if you are not rooted in those disciplines, you'll become an easy victim of, fake news, popular beliefs, anything that is around you.
I have more follow-ups, but I know that people here too. So I'm going to go around. If anyone wants to raise your hand, I'll come to you with a microphone for a question for Andreas or a comment. Yes. And if you would, I know many of you know each other by now, but if you would, just repeat your name and your organization and where you're from.
Hi, I'm Adrian von Vrede-Jervis from the Bavarian International School in Germany. I'm interested, have you done any analysis of interdisciplinary skills and whether that has a leverage in terms of performance?
Actually, most of the PISA tasks are embedded in interdisciplinary contexts. We always, focus on the cross-curricular aspects. And it's actually really interesting. Some students at age 15 have great difficulties translating a problem from one context into the context of another discipline. But this is where creative thinking and innovative thinking comes really from. It's about, connecting the dots, thinking across the boundaries of disciplines. But many students struggle with this. But that's basically, if you want to get to the right side of the chart, the complex problems, they're all interdisciplinary in the PISA context. They require deep mathematical knowledge, deep scientific thinking, but always embedded in a kind of interdisciplinary context, because the real world is interdisciplinary.
Thank you. Who else would like to pose a question or share a perspective? Give another couple moments, and then I'm going to ask more questions if I get a chance.
We heard a lot today about different competencies for employability. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the framework and particularly sort of what characteristics or skills sort of stand out as things we should be paying more attention to, I guess.
Yeah, we have the OECD, actually, we are just revising that framework. We have basically 4 dimensions. One is knowledge, one is skills, one is attitudes, the 4th is values. Knowledge is about content knowledge always, epistemic knowledge, and methodological knowledge. Now, those kinds of fields of knowledge are very important. When you look to skills, actually, there are disciplinary skills, but we put greater attention now also to the social and emotional skill dimensions. It's about, curiosity, resilience, adaptability, courage, leadership. Those kinds of dimensions are gaining in importance. We are not able yet to put them into numbers, but that is the kind of framework that we use. Sort of on the skill dimension, creativity, critical thinking, problem solving, you always find, but we are putting now more attention to the kind of deeper social emotional skills. On the attitudes, openness. Openness to divergent thinking, openness to sort of collaboration. Now that's where the global competency dimension that I highlighted also comes from. And then on the values question, there's a lot of debate at the moment. To what extent should values be part of a kind of curricular framework? But it's quite interesting. Internationally, there is pretty much an emerging consensus that we may not know what those values are, but the idea that students need to have orientation in themselves, that they need to sort of be able to have that kind of compass and the navigation skills in an uncertain world, in a world that no longer tells them what's right and wrong, what's true and not true. I think that's something that is pretty well established. So our new curriculum framework that we use at the OECD, different from the earlier ones, will include that value or character dimension. So those are the 4 broad classes that we are trying to elaborate now and also hopefully represent in future PISA assessments.
Andreas, I'm wondering if you could just elaborate on that last one in terms of the values and the character. As earlier today, we had a leader from Bertelsmann who was talking about AI, actually, and the way that ultimately humans create AI, but the values and the ethics, the character that the humans who design AI bring to AI will affect what degree AI is actually going to wind up expanding fairness and opportunity or diminishing it. Which then we talked a little bit about what are the implications for educating young people, not only with the data, knowledge of data and technology, but also the virtues, the compass, the character that can help drive something like that in the right direction. Could you share a little bit more about what your OECD approach is and is going to be to values and character?
Yeah, actually, we have very much the same thinking, but we don't project it only on work. I think actually the character dimension will be at least as important in the lives of people. Maybe actually work will play the kind of productive work, a less important role in our future lives, and sort of the social life will play a more important role in your capacity to engage with people, to work with people who are different from you, to find orientation. All of those things are very important. Values of human dignity, they are, the question, of course, people have is one day computers may develop consciousness, then everything is going to change. But until that date, I think that is a very, very important differentiator of human qualities, and I do think we need to actually, put greater emphasis on this. That's basically something that we're trying to do in our framework.
It is interesting when we're talking to employers. We go to the question at the back. We're talking to employers. Employers, when they say, hey, what do they need in people to be effective? Of course, there's the skills, but the knowledge. But there is, we hear a ton about what is the character, what are the values that will make somebody have the compass to be able to drive effective work in their organization. So you've got the next question, Tony.
We've heard a lot about computational thinking. Is that something PISA is looking into in terms of creating tests, assessments, or things of that nature to look at what students are doing in that area?
I think it's a very good point. Actually, we are looking in our 2021 mathematics assessment. We call it algorithmic thinking, but it's the same kind of thing. It's a question whether students can develop kind of structures that basically underpin what, today's computers are about. And, if you would have asked me, should we teach coding, which is another big question around, I would be very skeptical on this. Some people say, well, in today's age, you need to teach 3-year-olds coding. Now, by the time they graduate, they will ask themselves, actually, what was coding once? I think those practical applied tools lose quickly in relevance. But I think computational thinking, the algorithmic thinking, that's probably one of the enduring categories. In a way, when we think about mathematics, it's actually amazing. When you ask yourselves, why do we focus so much on calculus or trigonometry? And then many people say, well, that's mathematical thinking skills. Actually, nobody has ever shown that. The reason why we teach trigonometry and calculus is because 200 years ago, those were the skills that people needed to measure the size of the fields and the cities and so on. Today, in the world of mathematics, these skills are completely irrelevant. What matters today in the field of mathematics is, can you think in probabilities, in kind of nonlinear relationships? It's kind of, those are the things that matter today. Why don't we, computational thinking, why don't we do that? Because we have crowded out all of the student learning times with the things from 200 years ago. Now, we have always loaded new things on top of the curriculum, and we have never asked ourselves that kind of question. What is the essence of mathematics teaching? And I think that is a very, very good point. In the 2021 PISA assessment, we are doing that step. We're actually, putting out things that have no longer a relevance, even if they are taught in schools, and we're putting in those aspects that are actually very important in today's world. And I know how people are going to react to the new PISA test. They will say, it's another time that the OECD develops an unfair assessment that tests students on things we haven't taught them. And then we will answer, yes, we do that, and that's because life is unfair to those students. Now, they're going to do a lot of things that actually they haven't learned in school.
David's got the last question before we have a closing.
Andreas, we know that education is about a lot of things, about values, about human flourishing, but the cynics will say in the end it's about productivity, economic productivity. And the OECD puts the United States lower than most rankings, but even you put it 5th in the world. And the countries above it are nowhere at the top of your educational tables. And this has been true for years. And for at least the last 20 years, people have been saying, oh, wait, right? Education and productivity are going to begin to be better correlated as the new skills are needed. How do you answer the critics that say, wait a minute, if education is so important, if these levels are so critical, why don't we see a closer correlation with GDP productivity?
Yeah, it's actually, this is a very good question, but I think it actually has a very straightforward answer, but it's complicated. One thing is, One thing is you need to simply factor time into this. You know, why is the United States high in productivity? Because it has one of the highest skill distribution in the adult labor force. Why does it have a high sort of advanced skill distribution? Because it was the first country that invested in universal skilling. So basically what you see in the labor force today is the past, and that's actually producing a highly productive kind of. If you actually project that into the future, and if you actually disaggregate productivity statistics by age groups, you see a very different picture. Shanghai is already now far outperforming the United States in those kinds of productivity statistics. That's one part of the answer. The second part is more difficult. You know, to be productive, you need to do two things. You need to actually have people with great skills, and you need to have actually ways to extract value from those kinds of skills, to turn better skills into better jobs and better lives. And this is something that the US economy does better than anybody else. You know, it contrasts the two biggest economies in the OECD, the United States and Japan. Japan is very advanced in its skill distribution, but the economy is very rigid, very siloed, very structured. Women have very few chances to progress, so it uses only half of the human capital. So productivity is actually now about the same as in the United States. It used to be a lot lower, but it's sort of caught up. But the reason why it is so low is because the Japanese economy doesn't know how to use the skills of its people. The American economy is actually, relatively speaking, not great on its talent pool anymore, but it's very efficient in extracting value from this. Now, because the labor market is very mobile, people get allocated to the jobs which use their skills best. And that's actually one of the reasons why so many people come to the United States to work here. You know, to Silicon Valley, you look at all of creative people, you find actually a lot of people from many other places around the world. But the United States has been capable to extract that value and turn it into better jobs, better lives of people. That's the other side of productivity. But now you ask me, you know, which problem is easier to fix, the American one or the Japanese one? Actually, if the Japanese would fix the labor market, you know, get rid of that kind of rigidity in institutions, they could dramatically improve productivity. And you're going to see the same in China. And China is actually moving much faster than Japan on this. If you go to some of the most dynamic regions in coastal China, they are combining the American kind of productivity and extracting value from skills with a very kind of talented set of young people. The Japanese have not figured it out. Fixing the kind of American problem is a kind of long tail of poorly skilled individuals. That's going to take much more time.
Andreas, we're going to have to close in a second. I have one last question, maybe a quick thought. We have, tomorrow you're going to hear a little bit more about the PISA for schools, the OECD test for schools that OECD created. NWEA is here, I believe, and is really the lead sponsor now in the United States of being the administrator of that school level assessment that OECD and America Chiefs got going. We got a number of leaders in the Global Learning Network here who've been champions of the school level assessment, really informing practice. I'm wondering if you could just comment briefly, Andreas, why is that been important to you? And why, as the schools here who have not been participants in that, why should, in your view, they consider being part of the network of schools that are participating in that school level assessment?
Yeah, no, I think for me, is absolutely important, essentially important. You know, I do think the future of assessment doesn't lie with system-level assessment, you know, just giving government some aggregate statistics. The future of assessment lies in, you know, giving individual students good feedback on where they struggle, where they're not doing well, giving teachers good real-time feedback on how their students are progressing, giving schools good answers on where their strengths and relative weaknesses are. And that's exactly where the space in which we want to position the PISA for schools or the OECD test for schools. They're giving schools the kind of tools. Why PISA? Because we really believe that needs to be done on an international scale these days. Now, it's no longer enough to compare yourself with the neighboring schools, but it's about creating a kind of global community of world-leading schools. So that's the idea behind it. But for me, it's crucially important. You know, I don't believe, you know, things like PISA and NAEP will survive unless they provide answers to people in classrooms and answers to people leading schools. So I really believe that that's going to be the test of truth for the next generation of PISA assessments. Will they improve that kind of granularity? And that's the idea. And I'm very grateful, actually, to you, John, but also to the schools that have actually pioneered this tool, because it's actually evolving fast. You know, many of the kind of things that I've been talking about here will be building into that kind of test. That kind of digital problem-solving skills, even the kind of social problem-solving skills. I think those are the kind of opportunities that we have, and to build the kind of networks now. And it's actually very interesting when you look at this from the outside that you think schools are very different in a country, but many of the paradigms that we take for granted are actually deeply embedded in national institutional structures or cultures. And I think it's the kind of outside perspective that the PISA assessment for schools opens that really can change our thinking. And I remember, actually, there was one school principal from a charter school in Arizona, and I remember he called me once. He was actually one of in the first group of schools that had taken this test, and he said, well, you know, everybody told me I was number 4 in the some league table in the United States, and you're telling me I'm the 25th percentile of students in Shanghai? And then he actually went there. He actually visited. And he was absolutely fascinated by what he was seeing there. He could see basically there are other ways of teaching, there are other ways of learning. And I hope that that's something that, you know, assessment generally, that assessment will take on board. Assessment is not about moving information upward, it's about moving information sideward.
At its best it is, and this is a good example of how that's true. Tomorrow we'll hear a bit more with NWA here about how you all can participate in more and build on the schools that have. But for now, before we have a little participation awards for all of you who are here for the incredible role you are playing in your schools and the world, we want to give you a huge hand to Andreas Schleicher. Thank you so much for your leadership.